And then I realized that poetry is it's work, it's a craft. I mean, it's based on knowledge, and that in your poetry, if you're to be read by anybody, you have to perpetrate a sort of white lie. And the lie is that you are more interested in poetry than you are in yourself. And of course, you're not. It's an oxymoron, I think, a best-selling poet or popular poet. I don't know, I'm always pretty astounded by it. I mean, writing begins, particularly poetry, I think, begins in solitude, or in fact, poetry writing is sort of a deepening of solitude. And one of the reasons I was attracted to writing poetry particularly was it was something you did completely by yourself. So to be brought into the public, like to have a large audiences at readings, or to have been kind of thrust into the public eye through Poet Laureateship is, it's all very strange. I was appointed just months before 9/11, so that added an extra responsibility to the job in a way, because for whatever reasons, people did tend to turn to poetry then as a, well, I kind of know the reason. I think it's, people turn to poetry at weddings, funerals, rather nervous occasions, or for stability, because poems have some formality to them. They're often memorizable. There's a kind of incantation quality to the poem that has a way of settling and stabilizing emotion. So I was asked to write a poem by Congress, in fact. The poem I wrote is called The Names, and I read it before a joint session of Congress, which is a very unsettling experience. But I'll tell you one thing about that. When I read this poem, it was the first anniversary of 9/11. Prior to my reading of it, there were a number of speeches and eulogies and speeches by politicians. So when I started reading the poem, and the poem begins the way most poems do, with imagery. There's rain against the windows, there's a branch outside or something. I could see all the people in Congress, they were sort of cocked their heads like border collies, like, what is that, you know? And it was not political language, it was poetic language. And it really dramatized the severe difference between those two kinds of discourse, if you will. And then once they, having cocked their heads, they sort of figured out it's a poem. And at that point, half of them roughly kind of put out these poetry deflector shields that were installed in high school by most of us. And others, like Pat Moynihan particularly, you know, paid extra attention. It seemed to be the poetry was sort of a relief from the rhetoric of political language. I don't have the poem in a book. Of course, everything's out there on the internet. The poem was published in the New York Times on that day, but I've never put it in a book. I just never wanted to, I didn't want to detach it from its occasion and make it like part of my shtick, if you will, or just another poem in the book. It's sort of a special poem. A book comes together for me when I have enough poems. It's really, I'm never thinking when I'm writing, this is going to be part of this general work, this thematic, you know, orchestrated book. So all the books are kind of the same in a way, and that the theme of the book is me. I mean, that's basically me and death. Those are sort of the two obsessions of all the poems. So I'm not one of these writers that has, each book kind of has an arc of meaning or concern that is kind of begins and ends. They're just the poems I've written in the last 3 years would be a good title. No, not a good title, but an honest title for a book of poems. I didn't get my first book published till I was over 40. And the reason was I was not writing very good poetry. And the reason for that was I was kind of hobbled by a sense of decorum. And I was under the influence, heavily under the influence of a number of poets that I was imitating, people ranging from Lawrence Ferlinghetti to Wallace Stevens. And my imitations back then were so slavish that I was really writing kind of travesties of these people's work. And one of the main thing about the decorum I was following was that I was convinced by abundant example that there was no room for humor in poetry. Humor had been consigned to a sort of corral called light verse, and that is to say, light-headed and under-conceptualized and frankly rather silly. Even though I love Ogden Nash, that's sort of, he and other poets were sort of pushed over into this siding. And my theory about what happened has to do with English Romanticism. Because prior to around 1800, and here's the professor coming out, but humor was an integral part of English literature. Chaucer's funny, Shakespeare wrote comedies, the metaphysical poets depend entirely on verbal wit. After them comes the Augustans, and they use satire, which is basically laughing at other people. And then the Romantics come along, and what happened was, I imagine a kind of backroom meeting with Wordsworth and Coleridge and maybe somebody else, and they decided that they would remove from poetry sex and humor, and they would substitute landscape. And this strikes me as a bad deal. I mean, I feel shorted by that. But humor never recovered until around the 50s, around the time of Philip Larkin and Kenneth Koch, and more recently Charles Simic in the 60s and 70s. They taught me that you could be funny without being silly. You could be funny and dark. You know, you could be funny and extremely serious. So I had permission to, I was repressing my sense of humor throughout those early decades of writing. And now I could allow that into the poetry, and that's when I started writing poems that I felt that I wrote and not too many other people could have written, so. Well, you can't try to be funny, that's disastrous. I think it's a way of seeing things, that humor is epistemological. It's a way, it's an angle from which that you look at the world from. It's not just trying to be funny. It's actually your angle of apprehension that is being reflected. And I think there's something authentic about humor, because if anyone who's had a job, or anyone who's even sat in a classroom, which would include pretty much everybody, we all know what it is to pretend to be serious. I mean, you just put on a serious, both of us are sort of pretending to be serious right now, to some degree, and failing, but to some degree. We know it's very easy to pretend to be serious. You can fool people. You cannot pretend to be funny. You can't put it on. It's either there or not. It's funny or it's not funny. So in that way, there's something quite authentic about humorous poetry, and perhaps more reliable and credible than poetry that is deadly serious. Just because there's a teacup there, or a portrait of somebody, or a bookcase, doesn't mean, I mean, I could stare at it all day and nothing would come of it, perhaps. Because besides the item, you know, the particular daily thing that poems often start with, you need more than that. You need a sense of momentum. You have to think of that object, maybe whatever it is, the dog's leash or the teacup or the potted plant or something, as a point of insertion into something that has some role to it. So the object has to give up some secret about itself and suggest you could start here and a path would occur, you know, would be made visible. So otherwise, yeah, I would just be writing poems all day and all night about the broom. It's not work. There's a focusing, there's a concentration, there's a dissatisfaction when things aren't going right, and and the poem's not working, and I guess that's kind of work, but that focus, that narrowing down of your field of interest, you know, in composition, the mind is not scattered anymore. It's not thinking of, you know, your mortgage or what you're going to do next weekend or any of the kind of monkey mind stuff that fills our heads. It's a way of conscribing, you know, a field of play, and it's language play really. So that's why it's, yeah, to me it's very pleasurable, exciting really. And when it's not happening, it's very frustrating not to have written a poem for weeks, say. To be Irish is sort of, it's a neuroses. It's an odd figuring out what that means. It's because I think Irishness can be, you can inhabit Irishness in a lot of different ways. And I think, not to simplify other people, but I think to inhabit Frenchness is, there are fewer ways to do that. I think, you know, as American Irish people tend to sort of measure themselves in terms of their distance or intimacy with Ireland or Irish-ness. I mean, two examples. If you take Irishness as having these two forks, or these two tines, one is sort of Anglo-Irish and one is, I guess, Irish-Irish. So Yeats, you know, being Anglo-Irish, refers in his poem as "we Irish." We Irish have to do this. He's claiming this Irishness and speaking for the Irish, speaking for the Irish poets, particularly in that poem. Joyce, on the other hand, who is, I would say, Irish-Irish, Catholic Irish, exiles himself and refers to "you Irish," you Irish. You know, he is sort of, he couldn't be more Irish, and his subjects are, you know, Irishness itself in a way. And when he's working on, when he's writing, I think in Trieste, he has a huge map of Dublin in front of him. He's got Dublin bus schedules and all that, because he just physically went away, but it was always there. But he says "you Irish" because he's distancing himself from it. And although Yeats is already distanced by being ascendancy, he's claiming Irishness by saying "we Irish." And those, that we and you, those are, I think, ways to indicate these at least two angles of approach to it. I think my sensibility tends to be Irish, if I understand the Irish sensibility to be correct, particularly where humor and darkness overlap. I mean, I remember Samuel Beckett once said that there's nothing as funny as human unhappiness. You know, if you go to a Beckett play, I find this interesting. I haven't been to one in a while, but the audience immediately splits into two halves. And one half is laughing, and the other half is looking at the laughers as if they're committing an act of cultural disrespect. I'm one of the ones who are laughing. I mean, Beckett is just so, you know that expression, "I had to laugh"? That's the kind of laughter it is. You have to laugh. If you don't laugh, you're sinking. So I think that mix of, that blend of seriousness and tragic comedy, and that irony is something that, you know, it's a tone I find kind of prevalent in my poems. A poem called "Introduction to Poetry." I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
I don't myself go around thinking, oh, here I am, I'm an Irish writer, or I'm an Irish American writer, or I'm, you know, a male writer, or I don't really go around myself thinking in those terms, but I would like to be counted one if they'll have me. Poetry for me is about making sense of my life. I started trying to make sense of it back in Northern Ireland, where I was brought up. I've now lived in the US for most of 25 years, and I continue to make sense, or attempt to make sense of my life here. It's essential for me that the poem be an act of discovery, that I find out something, or that the poem finds out something, you know, through me, something about itself and what it will mean to be itself in the world. You know, I was quoted somewhere as describing going into one of my poems like going to a party in someone's house, and you're sort of in there having a good time, and you discover that the host has disappeared through the bathroom window. It's certainly true that I give myself over to the idea that I don't have much to do with it, that I'm just a medium for the poem, a channel for the poem. And that's not a matter of opinion, actually, it's how I experience it. I don't know what I'm doing, then you won't know what I'm doing. And both of us, we hope, will be taken aback, shocked, surprised, modified in some way, changed in some way, and you'll come out of the poem ideally thinking, my God, what happened to me in there? It is what it is. It is what it is, the popping underfoot of the bubble wrap in which Asher's new toy came, popping like bladder wrack on the foreshore of a country toward which I've been rowing for 50 years. I was born in Northern Ireland, as we know it, County Armagh, about halfway across Northern Ireland. And I was raised by a mother who was a school teacher and a father who was, as we describe him now in New Jersey terms certainly, a truck farmer. That was one of his main occupations. He grew things, and he generally had a fine old time. So I suppose in some sense I've tried to learn from both of them, the school teacherly mother and the father who had as good a time as he possibly could, and lived, you know, in some sense from day to day, rather than with this sense of the big picture that my mother purported to have. So I think I sort of shuttle back and forth between the two of them. Then the secondary school, the grammar school I went to, was a terrific school. And I had wonderful teachers who really encouraged me in a word or two to read and write and write more and do a bit more writing, in fact, and then write more after that. I had at least one teacher who was very plugged in to the local literary scene. He introduced me to Seamus Heaney, who was already in 1968 when I met him, already very well known. And Seamus then as now was very supportive, and when I went to university in Belfast a year or two after that, he was my tutor. And he introduced me to all the local writers, not only poets, but novelists and playwrights, short story writers, in what was known then, or certainly became known as the Belfast Group. And those were poets and writers of other kinds, as I say, who got together every couple of weeks to discuss one another's work. It was a workshop. So basically what I did was I was thrown in as whatever I was, 18 or 19 years of age, in with the big boys, as it were, which is exactly how it should be. And indeed, as a teacher myself, I'm often trying to encourage my students in the idea that at the age of 18 or 19, they are as likely, if not more likely, to do something more interesting than those of us who are in fact a bit longer in the tooth. We tend to believe that poetry is never about what it seems to be about. It's always about something else. We feel that we're shut out from it, that it's encoded in some sense, that it's difficult, that it's not for us. The truth is that some of it is difficult. Some of it is not for everyone. In fact, my own theory is that we'd get more people to read poetry if we were to say, poetry is not for everyone. Actually, you shouldn't be reading poetry, i.e. to list it as a Class A drug, so that people would feel they were breaking some law were they to read it. It comes as no surprise to us that in so many other aspects of our lives, be it watching a movie, watching a television program, listening to music, going to a concert, we've actually had to put in a lot of time and effort in learning how to do that. It doesn't come naturally to us to realize what a flashback is, what a dream sequence is. We've had to learn all that. So it shouldn't come as any surprise to us that poetry is something that we need to learn to read. The way to learn and to accept happily that one has to learn to read poetry is to do some of it. My peeping from behind a tamarind at the peeping ox and ass, the flyer for a pantomime, the inlaid cigarette box, the shamrock-painted jug, the New Testament bound in red leather, lying open, Lordy, on her lap, while I mull over the rules of this imperspicuous game that seems to be missing one piece, if not more. It does seem to be the case that the Irish are, in this country, those of Irish origin, are very, very connected to an idea of Ireland that, in many cases, is out of date. I mean, my idea of Ireland is perhaps out of date, and the idea of Ireland that we had in 5 years ago is in some sense out of date. So the idea of an idea of Ireland that might have been current in 1845 is almost certainly out of date. But that doesn't diminish the engagement, you know? It really doesn't. I mean, part of it, as with so many other cultures who have become Americanized, you know, part of what we're looking at is a real pain that's associated with leaving the home place. You know, whether or not one was involved in a pogrom or a potato famine or whatever it might have been. So there's trauma associated with it. And I think the Irish themselves are living in a post-traumatic circumstance, and I'm sure Irish Americans are often living in the same. Now, whether our experience has been any more traumatic than most people in the world is debatable. Her voice at the gridiron, coming and going, as if snatched by a sea wind. My mother, shipping out for good this time. The game, the plaything spread on the rug. The 50 years I've spent trying to put it together. One of the things I try to remember is the extraordinary buzz that one has at the age of 16 or 17 when I started writing, or 18 or 19. The excitement about seeing one's poem in print for the first time, you know, of publishing one's first little pamphlet, which in my case, I think it cost 10 pence, but it was the most wonderful experience. the most wonderful experience. And though one always runs the risk at 18 or 19 or 58 or 59 of self-delusion, the great, great risk, you know, one hopes that while being mindful of the possibility of self-delusion, that one doesn't lose something of that open-eyed, you know, just sheer joy at the sense that one has embarked on this great adventure. I'd like to think that if people come honestly and decently to some of the poems that I've written, that they would actually get from them a sense of someone who has attempted, with varying degrees of success perhaps, to make sense of what it meant to live in Ireland in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And indeed the 80s and 90s and into this century. And also what it means to be involved in relationships with one's lovers, with one's wife, with one's children. To be alive in the world,